On a crisp autumn evening in October 1998, the small logging town of Timber Ridge, Oregon was settling into its familiar rhythm. Friday night meant high school football, weekend plans scribbled on napkins at the diner, and for 4 young women who'd grown up in these hills, it meant freedom. The kind that comes when you're in your early 20s and the whole world still feels like it's opening up in front of you. But before that night ended, something would happen in those dense Oregon woods that would haunt this community for 2 decades. And the person responsible? That was someone no one in Timber Ridge could have imagined. Not in 1998. Not for 20 years after. Before we go any further into this story, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another crime story. This is about what happens when an entire town carries a secret without even knowing it. When justice takes so long that some people stop believing it exists at all. And I need you here for all of it. Timber Ridge sits in the coastal range of western Oregon, about 40 miles from the Pacific. In 1998, it was home to maybe 3,000 people, most of them connected to the timber industry in some way or another. Mill workers, loggers, truck drivers. Families who'd been there for generations. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, your parents' names, and probably has an opinion about both. The town had been built on timber money back in the 1920s. Main Street still had the original brick buildings from that era, the hardware store, the bank, the old theater that showed movies on weekends. There were 2 traffic lights. 1 grocery store. A diner that served breakfast all day and where the coffee was always hot and the gossip was always fresh. People didn't lock their doors. Kids rode their bikes to school. Friday nights in the fall, the entire town showed up to watch the high school football team play under the lights. It was the kind of place people either loved or couldn't wait to leave. Some did both, left for college or the city, then found themselves pulled back by something they couldn't quite name. The pace of life, maybe. The way you could still see stars at night. The way people remembered your grandmother and asked about your kids and showed up when you needed help. That October, 4 young women were preparing for what should have been an unremarkable weekend camping trip. Sarah Mitchell was 24, working as a receptionist at the local medical clinic. She'd been the responsible one since high school, the friend who drove everyone home, who remembered birthdays, who answered the phone at 2 in the morning when someone needed to talk. People at the clinic loved her. She had this way of making patients feel calm, even when they were worried or in pain. She remembered everyone's names, asked about their families, kept candy in her desk drawer for the kids who came in scared of getting shots. Her best friend since elementary school was Rachel Connors, 23, who'd recently started teaching 2nd grade at Timber Ridge Elementary. Rachel had that infectious energy that made kids adore her and made every gathering feel a little more alive. She'd wanted to be a teacher since she was 8 years old, used to line up her stuffed animals and teach them lessons. Now, 2 months into her first real teaching job, she was living that dream. Her classroom was decorated with student artwork and motivational posters. She stayed late every afternoon, planning lessons, grading papers, making sure she was doing right by her students. Then there was Jennifer Hayes, 22, who everyone called Jenny. She worked at her family's hardware store on Main Street, the same store her grandfather had opened in 1947. Jenny had grown up behind that counter, knew every regular customer by name, could tell you which brand of paint primer worked best on the damp Oregon coast. Her grandfather had died the previous year, and Jenny had taken on more responsibility in the store, working alongside her father to keep the business running the way it always had. She had a gift for it, people said. Could talk to contractors and weekend DIYers with the same ease, always knew exactly what people needed even when they couldn't quite explain it themselves. And finally, there was Amanda Price, 26, the oldest of the group. Amanda had left Timber Ridge for college in Portland, worked in the city for a few years as a graphic designer, then come back home the previous spring. She'd been engaged to someone in Portland, but that had fallen apart in ways that left her questioning everything she thought she wanted. She'd come back to Timber Ridge to figure out what came next, was waitressing at the diner while she thought about her options. She'd reconnected with these women, Sarah and Rachel she'd known since childhood, Jenny she'd gotten to know better since coming home, and their friendship had reminded her why she'd missed this place. Why, despite everything, there was something about home that pulled at you. The four of them had planned this camping trip for weeks. Nothing elaborate. Just a weekend at a familiar spot about 15 miles outside town, up in the hills where they'd camped as teenagers. A place they all knew, where they'd spent summer nights around fires, telling stories and making plans for futures that seemed limitless back then. It was a place to disconnect, to catch up properly, to sit around a fire and remember who they were before bills and responsibilities and the weight of adult life settled in. They'd talked about it at the diner the week before. Amanda had suggested it. She wanted to do something outdoors before the weather turned, before the heavy rains came that would last through winter. Sarah had immediately agreed. Rachel had cleared it with the school, she didn't have any parent-teacher conferences that week. Jenny had asked her father to cover the store for the weekend. Everything had fallen into place easily, the way plans sometimes do when they're meant to happen. They spent that week getting ready. Sarah borrowed a camping stove from her brother. Rachel picked up groceries, hot dogs, buns, potato chips, the kind of simple food that tastes better when you're sitting outside. Jenny gathered flashlights and batteries from the hardware store. Amanda made a playlist for the drive. They were excited in that particular way adults get when they're about to do something that reminds them of being young and carefree. They left town around 6 that Friday evening in Sarah's blue Ford Explorer. Someone at the gas station saw them fill up. The attendant, a kid named Marcus who'd graduated high school 2 years earlier, remembered them laughing as they paid for gas and snacks. Someone else saw them loading coolers and sleeping bags in the parking lot behind Jenny's hardware store. Jenny waved to her father as they drove past, and he waved back, watching them disappear down Main Street toward the highway that would take them into the hills. These were the kinds of details people would replay over and over in the weeks and months and years that followed. The last normal moments. The last time anyone saw these four women alive. Marcus at the gas station would remember the exact snacks they bought: Doritos, Oreos, a bag of marshmallows. Jenny's father would remember the way she'd smiled when she waved, how happy she'd looked. These small, ordinary moments would become precious later, when they were all that remained. When they didn't return Sunday afternoon as planned, families tried not to worry immediately. Cell phone reception was spotty in those hills, everyone knew that. Maybe they'd decided to stay an extra night. Maybe the car had trouble and they were waiting for a tow. Maybe they'd run into old friends at another campsite and lost track of time. These were reasonable explanations. Young people changed plans. Things came up. But when Monday morning arrived and none of them showed up for work, when calls to the campsite went unanswered, worry transformed into something colder. Something that settled in the chest and wouldn't leave. Sarah's mother, Linda Mitchell, called the medical clinic at 8:30 Monday morning. Her daughter had never missed work without calling. Never. It wasn't like Sarah. She was responsible to a fault, the kind of person who showed up 15 minutes early and stayed late if someone needed help. When the clinic confirmed that Sarah hadn't shown up and hadn't called in, Linda felt her stomach drop. That cold feeling spread through her limbs. Something was wrong. She called Rachel's parents. They hadn't heard from Rachel either, and they were starting to worry too. Rachel was supposed to be at school, teaching her second graders, but the school had called looking for her. She called Jenny's father at the hardware store. He'd been trying to reach Jenny all morning, had even driven by her apartment to check if her car was there. It wasn't. Amanda's mother was already on the phone with friends, asking if anyone had heard from the girls, if anyone knew if they'd changed their plans. By noon, the parents had gathered at the Mitchell house. 6 sets of parents sitting in Linda Mitchell's living room, trying to stay calm, trying to think logically. They went over everything they knew. The girls had left Friday evening. They'd planned to camp Friday and Saturday night, come home Sunday afternoon. It was now Monday. Where were they? Maybe the car had broken down and they were hiking out. Maybe they'd gone to a different campsite and lost track of time. Maybe there was a simple explanation they just hadn't thought of yet. But underneath the reasonable explanations, fear was building. Because all four of them? All four not calling, not showing up, not responding? That didn't make sense. Even if something had happened, even if the car broke down or someone got hurt, at least one of them would have found a way to call. Wouldn't they? Sarah's mother called the sheriff's office Monday afternoon. The dispatcher took the information, asked questions about where the girls had been headed, what kind of vehicle they were driving, when they were last seen. She promised someone would look into it, would drive out to the campsite and check. But there was a tone in her voice, a careful professional distance that made Linda Mitchell want to scream. This wasn't just a routine call about some kids who'd stayed out too late. This was her daughter. This was 4 young women who should have been home by now. By Tuesday morning, that careful professional distance had evaporated. Sheriff's deputies drove out to the trailhead, and they found Sarah's Explorer parked exactly where it should have been. The vehicle was locked. Nothing looked disturbed. But there was no sign of the 4 women. The deputies hiked up to the campsite, following the trail the girls would have taken. And what they found there made them call for backup immediately. What they found next would fracture this community in ways that still haven't fully healed. The campsite was located about 1.5 miles up an old logging road, accessible by a trail that wound through dense Douglas fir and western hemlock. The trees in that part of the forest were old growth, massive trunks that blocked out the sun even at midday. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and salal, and the forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles and decomposing wood. It was beautiful country, but it was also the kind of place where you could walk 20 feet off a trail and disappear completely. When deputies reached the site Wednesday morning, everything looked eerily normal at first. The tent was still standing, a dome tent in faded blue that Sarah had bought years ago. Sleeping bags were laid out inside, 4 of them, arranged neatly. A cooler sat near the fire ring, food still packed inside. Someone had started to make a fire but hadn't finished. There were logs arranged in the pit, kindling ready, but no signs of burning. Flashlights sat inside the tent. Backpacks leaned against trees. It looked like they'd set up camp and then just vanished. Like they'd been in the middle of settling in for the evening when something interrupted them. But there were no signs of struggle. No overturned equipment. No indication of what might have happened or where they might have gone. The search intensified immediately. By Wednesday afternoon, volunteers from Timber Ridge and surrounding towns were flooding into those hills. The sheriff's office coordinated with state police, brought in search and rescue teams, established a command center at the trailhead. Over 200 people combing through terrain that could hide anything. The timber companies sent their crews, men who knew these woods better than anyone, who could read the land and spot things others might miss. Local businesses shut down so people could join the search. The hardware store closed. The diner stayed open but only to serve coffee and sandwiches to searchers. The school brought in substitute teachers so that staff members could volunteer. Parents kept their kids home, partly to help search, partly because they couldn't bear to let them out of sight. For 4 days, that forest echoed with voices calling out names. Sarah. Rachel. Jenny. Amanda. Search teams worked in grids, covering every square foot of accessible terrain. They checked ravines, creek beds, game trails. They brought in dogs. They flew helicopters overhead, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance in the canopy. Nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed 4 people whole and left no trace. The waiting was its own kind of torture for the families. They gathered at the command center, bringing food for volunteers, watching the maps where searchers marked off covered areas, hoping desperately that the next radio call would bring good news. But as the hours turned into days, that hope began to feel more like denial. Deep down, they knew. When 4 healthy young women vanish completely in terrain they knew well, when there's no trace despite hundreds of people searching, it means something terrible has happened. Then, on the 5th day, a volunteer found Rachel Connors. His name was Thomas Chen, a logger who'd worked these hills for 20 years. He was searching a ravine so steep and thickly forested that earlier teams had passed it by, figured it was too difficult to access on foot. But Chen had insisted on checking it, had climbed down using tree roots and exposed rock as handholds. Rachel was at the bottom of that ravine, partially hidden by the dense undergrowth and the autumn leaves that had already begun to fall. And she wasn't alone. Within hours, as more searchers converged on that location, all 4 women had been found in that same ravine, their bodies scattered across an area of maybe 30 yards. I'm not going to describe what happened to them in detail. That's not what this story is about, and it's not what they deserve to be remembered for. What you need to know is that they didn't die by accident. This wasn't a hiking mishap or a tragic encounter with wildlife. Someone had done this to them. Someone had killed 4 young women who'd come to these woods for nothing more than a weekend away from the world. The investigation that followed would eventually involve state police, FBI consultants, and dozens of local law enforcement officers working around the clock. But in those first terrible days, Timber Ridge was drowning in grief and fear and questions that had no immediate answers. Who would do something like this? Why? And were they still out there? The memorial service was held on a Saturday, 11 days after the women disappeared. The high school gymnasium was the only space in town large enough to hold everyone who came. More than 1,000 people filled that room. Folding chairs arranged in rows that stretched wall to wall. For caskets at the front, each draped with flowers. For families trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. The school choir sang. They'd chosen Amazing Grace because it was the only hymn that everyone knew, the only song that felt right even though nothing felt right. Friends gave eulogies that broke apart halfway through. Sarah's co-worker from the clinic talked about her kindness. One of Rachel's students read a letter she'd written, her small voice trembling but determined. Jenny's father stood at the podium for a full minute without speaking, just looking at his daughter's casket, before he finally managed to say that she'd been the best thing in his life. Amanda's sister read a poem their mother had chosen, her hands shaking so badly the paper rustled audibly in the silence. And everyone in that gymnasium was thinking the same thing: this doesn't happen here. Not in Timber Ridge. Not to people we know. Not to people we love. But it had happened. And as the shock began to fade, it was replaced by something else. Fear. Suspicion. The constant, gnawing awareness that someone in this community might know something. Might be hiding something. Might be responsible. The investigation in those early weeks was massive. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. Anyone who'd been in the area that weekend. Anyone who'd had contact with the 4 women in the days before they left. Anyone who owned a vehicle that matched descriptions of trucks or cars seen on the logging roads. They looked at ex-boyfriends, former classmates, anyone with a history of violence or inappropriate behavior. They examined the women's lives in forensic detail, looking for connections, for someone who might have had a reason, any reason, to target them specifically. They pulled phone records. They checked credit card statements. They talked to people at the gas station, at the grocery store, at the bank. They interviewed Sarah's co-workers, Rachel's fellow teachers, Jenny's customers at the hardware store, Amanda's friends from Portland. They were looking for anything: a threatening letter, a stalker, a rejected advance, a grudge, a jealousy, any thread that might lead them to whoever had done this. But nothing made sense. These were 4 women from different parts of town, different social circles. Sarah and Rachel had been lifelong friends, sure. But Jenny had only become close with them in the last year or so. Amanda had just reconnected with the group after being away. There was no obvious link beyond their friendship. No shared enemy. No clear motive that investigators could identify. The forensic evidence from the scene told them some things but not enough. There were footprints in the soft earth near the campsite that didn't match any of the women's shoes. There were tire tracks on the logging road that might have been fresh or might have been there for weeks. There were fibers collected from the tent and from the ravine that would need to be analyzed. But in 1998, processing that kind of evidence took time. Weeks. Months. And even then, it might not point to anyone specific without a suspect to compare it against. The theory that eventually took hold was the one that frightened people most. That this had been random. That the killer had simply been in those woods, had seen 4 young women camping alone, and had made a choice that destroyed 4 families and traumatized an entire town. Random meant it could happen again. Random meant no one was safe. Random meant that the person responsible could be anyone. Could be the guy who bagged your groceries. Could be your coworker. Could be your neighbor. Could be someone you'd known your whole life and never suspected of anything. tips flooded in. The sheriff's office set up a dedicated phone line that rang constantly for weeks. People reported suspicious vehicles they'd seen on the logging roads that weekend. Strangers who'd passed through town. A drifter someone had noticed at the gas station. A truck with out-of-state plates parked near the trailhead. A man who'd been acting strange at the diner. Every lead was investigated. Every possibility was chased down. Detectives drove thousands of miles, interviewed dozens more people, checked alibis, verified stories. And one by one, the leads went nowhere. The stranger at the gas station had been a tourist passing through on his way to the coast. The out-of-state truck belonged to someone visiting family. The man at the diner was just having a bad day. The drifter had been 3 counties away when the women died. Every suspicious person turned out to have an explanation. Every promising tip dissolved under scrutiny. Forensic evidence from the scene was limited. This was 1998. DNA technology existed but wasn't what it would become even 5 years later. The state crime lab could extract DNA from samples, could build profiles, but the databases were small. There was no national system yet where you could run a profile and get instant hits. There was physical evidence, yes, but processing it, matching it, making sense of it in a way that could identify a suspect, that was a different challenge entirely. And in this case, whatever evidence investigators had wasn't pointing them toward anyone specific. 3 months after the murders, detectives brought in an FBI profiler. She spent a week in Timber Ridge, reviewing the case files, visiting the crime scene, interviewing the lead investigators. Her profile suggested they were looking for a local man, probably someone familiar with the area, possibly someone who worked in forestry or logging. Someone who might have a history of violence against women, though that violence might not have resulted in arrests. Someone who felt comfortable in the woods, who knew how to navigate that terrain, who wouldn't have stood out if seen in the area. But that description could fit hundreds of men in this part of Oregon. It was too broad. Too general. It didn't narrow the suspect pool in any meaningful way. Months passed. Then a year. The investigation never officially closed, but the intensity faded. Detectives had other cases that demanded their attention. The state police pulled back their resources. The FBI consultants returned to their field offices. The dedicated tip line was disconnected. The daily briefings stopped. The command center at the trailhead was dismantled. Life in Timber Ridge slowly, painfully resumed some version of normal. But the fear never entirely left. Parents kept their daughters closer. Women didn't go hiking alone anymore. People locked their doors at night now. The hardware store installed security cameras. The diner's staff started walking each other to their cars after closing. And in quiet conversations at church on Sunday mornings, at the grocery store, at the post office, people still asked, "Who did this?" By the second anniversary, a kind of resignation had set in. Some cases just don't get solved. That's what people told themselves. That's what they had to believe in order to keep living in this town, in order to keep walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores, sending their kids to the same schools. The alternative, living in constant fear and suspicion, was unsustainable. The local newspaper ran a story on the anniversary. Remembered the 4 women. Recounted the investigation. Mentioned that the case remained open but that no arrests had been made. They interviewed the sheriff, who said they were still following up on tips, still hopeful that someday they'd get the break they needed. But you could hear the resignation in his words. After 2 years, the trail wasn't just cold. It was frozen solid. But there were people who couldn't accept that. Who wouldn't? Sarah Mitchell's younger sister, Emily, was 16 when Sarah died. She'd idolized her older sister, had been counting down the days until she was old enough to join these camping trips, to be included in that circle of friendship and adventure. Sarah had promised that next summer, when Emily turned 17, she could come along. That promise would never be kept. After Sarah's death, Emily withdrew. She stopped hanging out with friends. Stopped participating in school activities. She'd sit in Sarah's room for hours, looking at photographs, reading old journals, trying to hold on to something of her sister that felt real. Her grades dropped. She stopped sleeping properly. Her parents worried she'd never recover from this. But something else was happening during those quiet hours in Sarah's room. Emily was thinking. Processing. Trying to understand. And what she kept coming back to was this: someone had done this. Someone had killed her sister. And that someone was still out there, still living their life, still free while Sarah was gone forever. That thought became like a splinter in her mind. She couldn't stop returning to it, couldn't let it go. She struggled through the rest of high school, through college at the University of Oregon. But something had taken root in her during those years. A quiet, steady determination that someone had to keep asking questions. Someone had to make sure Sarah and Rachel and Jenny and Amanda weren't forgotten. That their deaths meant something more than a cold case file in a storage room. Emily majored in criminal justice. She interned at a law office, learned about how investigations work, how evidence is processed, how cold cases sometimes get solved years or decades after the crime. She wasn't trying to become a detective or a lawyer. She just wanted to understand. Wanted to know enough to keep her sister's case from disappearing completely. By 2008, Emily was 26. The same age Amanda Price had been when she died. That parallel wasn't lost on her. She'd lived as many years now as Amanda had total. She'd graduated college, started a career, fallen in and out of love, experienced things that Sarah and Rachel and Jenny and Amanda would never get to experience. And with each year that passed, the injustice of it grew heavier rather than lighter. Emily had moved back to Timber Ridge after college and was working as a paralegal at a law office in the county seat, 30 miles away. She'd spent the past decade learning everything she could about criminal investigations, about cold cases, about how evidence gets re-examined when time passes and technology changes. She'd read books, attended conferences, joined online forums where people discussed unsolved cases. She'd become something of an expert on DNA technology, on forensic advances, on the ways that cases from the 90s and early 2000s were being revisited with new tools. She started making calls. To the sheriff's office. To the state police. Asking about the evidence that had been collected in her sister's case. About whether there were items that could be retested with newer methods. About whether anyone was still actively looking at this case. About whether there were tips that had never been fully followed up on. About whether the case files had been digitized or were still just sitting in boxes somewhere. The answers were mostly what she expected. The case was still open, technically. But without new leads, there wasn't much to investigate. The evidence had been catalogued and stored properly, they assured her of that. If new information came in, they'd absolutely follow up. But after 10 years, the trail was cold. Most cold cases that get solved are solved within the first 5 years or not at all. After a decade, the chances drop dramatically. Emily kept pushing. She wasn't accusatory. She wasn't demanding. She was just persistent. Respectfully, relentlessly persistent. She wrote letters to the district attorney's office. She contacted cold case organizations. She reached out to retired detectives who'd worked the original investigation, asking them to share whatever they remembered, whatever details might not be in the official files. She wanted to understand not just what had been done, but what hadn't been done. What leads hadn't been followed. What questions hadn't been asked. Most of the retired detectives were sympathetic but didn't have much to offer. They'd done everything they could at the time. They'd worked the case hard, followed every lead, pursued every possibility. It just hadn't been enough. Some of them apologized to her, as if it were their personal failure that the case remained unsolved. She told them she understood. She didn't blame them. She just needed to know that someone still cared. That someone was still trying. One of those retired detectives was a man named Frank Dalton. He'd been with the county sheriff's office for 30 years before retiring in 2005, and the murders in 1998 had been the worst case of his career. He'd worked it obsessively for 2 years, then watched as it slowly faded from priority status, as resources got allocated elsewhere, as the likelihood of solving it seemed to diminish with each passing month. It had haunted him into retirement. He'd lie awake at night sometimes, replaying interviews in his head, wondering what he'd missed. When Emily reached out to him in 2009, Dalton was 70 years old and living in a small house on the outskirts of town. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and he lived alone with his dog and his regrets. They met at his kitchen table on a rainy afternoon in March, and Emily brought a notebook filled with questions she'd been compiling for years. Dalton talked for 3 hours. He told her things that weren't in the public record. Not because they were secret, but because no one had ever asked him directly. He talked about the early days of the investigation, about the dozens of people they'd interviewed, about the dead ends and the frustrations and the leads that looked promising until they didn't. He talked about the pressure from the families, from the media, from his own superiors. He talked about the guilt he still carried, the feeling that he'd somehow failed these 4 women and their families. Emily listened. Took notes. Asked follow-up questions. And then she asked him something specific. Were there any suspects who'd been looked at and dismissed that he'd always wondered about? Anyone who'd seemed off in some way that he couldn't quite articulate? Anyone who'd stuck in his mind even after they'd been cleared? Dalton thought about that for a long moment. Then he got up from the table and disappeared into a back room. He returned carrying a cardboard box, the kind that copy paper comes in. Inside were files, notebooks, photographs. His personal copies of everything related to the case. Things he'd kept when he retired because he couldn't bring himself to let go completely. He pulled out a notebook, flipped through pages covered in his own handwriting, and then stopped on a particular entry. He mentioned a name that had come up during the original investigation. Not a suspect, exactly. More like a person of interest who'd been briefly looked at, then dismissed. Michael Voss. Michael Voss was a Timber Ridge native, born and raised. In 1998, he'd been 32 years old, working as a foreman for one of the local timber companies. Married, father of 2 young children. Well-liked in the community. Coached Little League. Volunteered at the fire department. The kind of person you'd trust without hesitation. The kind of person who'd help you move furniture or jumpstart your car or lend you tools without asking when you'd return them. During the initial investigation, Voss had come to the attention of investigators because he'd been working in the area that weekend. His crew had been doing some maintenance work on logging roads not far from where the women had been camping. He'd been interviewed, like dozens of other people who'd been in the vicinity. He said he'd been working, had left the site around 4 on Friday afternoon, hadn't seen anything unusual. His co-workers confirmed his timeline. He'd seemed cooperative, concerned, genuinely shocked by what had happened. There was no reason to look at him more closely. No reason to suspect him of anything. But Dalton remembered something. A detail that had nagged at him over the years. During that initial interview, Voss had mentioned that he sometimes used that particular area for personal recreation. He hunted there in the fall. He knew the trails. He'd been camping there himself over the years. And he'd volunteered that information unprompted, in a way that Dalton, looking back, found slightly odd. Why mention that? Why make sure investigators knew you were familiar with that location? Was he establishing a reason his presence in the area would be normal? Or was it just someone being helpful, providing context? At the time, it hadn't meant much. Lots of local people used those woods. Knowing the area didn't make someone a suspect. But now, more than a decade later, Dalton found himself wondering if he'd missed something. If they'd all missed something. Emily started doing her own research. She was careful. She didn't approach Voss directly or do anything that could be considered harassment or stalking. But she looked into his background, his history, his life in the years since 1998. Public records. Social media. Court documents. Property records. Employment history. Anything she could access legally. What she found was, on the surface, exactly what you'd expect. He'd continued working for the timber company, had been promoted to supervisor around 2000. His kids had grown up, graduated from high school. His marriage had ended in divorce around 2004, but that wasn't unusual. Lots of marriages ended. He'd remarried a few years later to a woman from a neighboring town. He'd moved from his house on the south side of town to a smaller place closer to the mill. He'd stopped coaching Little League around the time of the divorce. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that screamed guilt. But Emily noticed something else. Something subtle. In the years immediately after the murders, Voss had been deeply involved in the community. He'd been visible, active, present. He'd been at town meetings, at fundraisers, at community events. But gradually, over time, he'd withdrawn. Stopped coaching. Stopped volunteering at the fire department. Became more isolated. He still went to work, still showed up for his job, but the rest of his community involvement just faded away. Again, this could mean nothing. People change. Marriages end and lives shift. Interests evolve. Priorities change. Maybe he'd just gotten tired of volunteering. Maybe the divorce had been difficult and he'd pulled back socially. Maybe he'd developed hobbies that kept him home more. There were a dozen innocent explanations for why someone might become less socially active over the course of a decade. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something there. Some pattern she couldn't quite see. It reminded her of something she'd read about criminal psychology, how perpetrators sometimes stay very visible immediately after their crimes, inserting themselves into investigations or community responses, but then gradually withdraw as the years pass and the fear of being caught diminishes. She brought her findings back to Dalton. Together, over the course of several months, they went through everything they could access from the original investigation. Dalton had kept copies of his notes, his personal files, witness statements, interview transcripts. Things that weren't part of the official record but that he'd held onto because this case had never let him go. And in those files, they found something interesting. Another detail from Voss's original interview that had seemed innocuous at the time but looked different through the lens of suspicion. He'd mentioned driving past the trailhead that Friday evening, around 6 or 6:30, and noticing Sarah Mitchell's blue Explorer parked there. At the time, this had actually seemed helpful. It confirmed the timeline of when the women had arrived. Voss had been cooperative, providing information that corroborated what investigators already knew. But now, thinking about it differently, Emily and Dalton both had the same thought. How did Voss know it was Sarah Mitchell's vehicle? It was just a blue Explorer. There were probably dozens of similar vehicles in the area. Had he recognized it specifically? And if so, why would he have known what car Sarah Mitchell drove? They weren't friends. They didn't socialize in the same circles. Sarah worked at the medical clinic. Voss worked in the timber industry. Their paths wouldn't have crossed regularly. Maybe he'd seen her around town and happened to remember her vehicle. Small towns work that way sometimes. Or maybe he'd mentioned recognizing the vehicle later, after learning about the case, and the detective's notes had gotten the timing confused. Or maybe there was something more to it. This wasn't evidence. It wasn't even close to evidence. But it was enough to make them wonder if Michael Voss deserved a second look. Emily Mitchell took everything she and Dalton had compiled to the current county sheriff in the spring of 2010. The sheriff's name was Patricia Crane, and she'd only been in office for 2 years. The 1998 murders had happened before her time, before she'd even worked in this county, but she knew the case. Everyone in law enforcement in this part of Oregon knew the case. It was the kind of crime that got talked about at conferences, that got used as an example in training sessions, that hung over the department like an unsolved question mark. Crane listened to Emily's presentation. She reviewed the materials Emily had brought, Dalton's notes, the timeline inconsistencies, the questions about how Voss had recognized Sarah's vehicle, the pattern of social withdrawal over the years. And she agreed that it was worth reopening the investigative file on Michael Voss. Not because they had proof of anything. Not because what Emily had found would be enough to charge anyone. But because after 12 years, this was the first time anyone had brought forward a coherent reason to look at a specific person again. The reinvestigation started quietly. Crane didn't want word getting out that they were looking at someone. Didn't want to spook a potential suspect or raise false hopes in the families or create a media circus that might compromise the investigation. She assigned 2 of her best detectives to the case. They began pulling files, reviewing evidence, looking at everything with fresh eyes and the benefit of 12 years of hindsight. They re-interviewed some of the people who'd worked with Voss back in 1998, asking questions in slightly different ways, seeing if anyone remembered details that hadn't seemed important at the time. They tried to track down the truck Voss had been driving in 1998, the one he'd supposedly gotten rid of due to mechanical problems. Where had it gone? Had it been sold, scrapped, traded in? If they could find it, maybe there was evidence still there. But after 12 years, the trail was cold. The truck had passed through multiple owners, had finally been totaled in an accident in 2006, and had been crushed for scrap. And slowly, carefully, they began to build a picture that looked different than it had 12 years earlier. One of Voss's former co-workers, a man named David Torres, remembered that on the Monday after the women disappeared, Voss had seemed distracted. Not worried, exactly. Just distant. Like his mind was somewhere else. Torres had asked if everything was okay, and Voss had said he was fine, just tired. At the time, they'd all been distracted, the whole town was talking about the missing women. Everyone was worried. But now, looking back, Torres wondered if there'd been something more to it. Something specific about the way Voss had avoided eye contact, had kept to himself that day. Another person, a woman who'd been Voss's neighbor in 1998, remembered that Voss had changed vehicles shortly after the murders. She remembered because she'd asked him about it. They'd talked occasionally over the fence, the way neighbors do. He'd been driving an older pickup truck for years, a brown Ford F-150 that he kept in good condition. Then suddenly, maybe 2 or 3 months after the murders, he had a different truck. When she'd asked about it, he'd said the old one had mechanical problems that would cost more to fix than the truck was worth. She'd thought that was odd at the time because she'd never seen it broken down, never heard him complain about problems with it. But it was his business, so she hadn't pushed. These were small things. Individually, they meant almost nothing. But together, they started to form a pattern. A mosaic of behaviors and choices that, when viewed through the lens of suspicion, looked less innocent than they had before. The biggest break came in 2011. Detectives decided to retest some of the physical evidence from the crime scene using DNA technology that hadn't existed, or hadn't been accessible to small county sheriff's offices, in 1998. The state crime lab had upgraded its equipment significantly. They could now extract DNA from smaller samples, get better profiles from degraded evidence, use more sophisticated comparison techniques. The process took months. The samples were old, degraded by time and storage conditions. The results were partial. Not the clean, complete profiles you'd want for a definitive match. But eventually, they got something. A partial DNA profile from evidence found at the scene. Not complete enough to run through databases and get a hit. But enough that if they had a suspect's DNA to compare it against, they might be able to establish a connection. And when they compared that partial DNA profile to samples they were able to obtain from Michael Voss, collected legally, through methods that involved surveillance, discarded items, and the assistance of DNA collection companies that operated within the bounds of constitutional law, they found something. Not a perfect match. The profile was too incomplete for that. But enough similarities in the markers they could compare that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The forensic analyst put the probability at roughly 1 in several thousand that the DNA could have come from someone else. That's not enough to convict someone on its own. Defense attorneys tear apart partial DNA matches all the time. But it was enough to suggest that Voss should be looked at even more closely. Enough to justify more resources, more investigation, more pressure. I need to be clear about something. What they had at this point was not enough to arrest anyone. It wasn't enough to charge anyone with a crime. What they had was a reason to keep investigating. A direction to move in. A suspect who looked more viable now than he had 12 years ago. And that's what they did. Throughout 2011 and into 2012, detectives continued building their case. They looked at Voss's timeline from that weekend in 1998 with microscopic attention to detail. They examined his phone records from back then, landline records, which the phone company had kept archived. They talked to more people who'd known him. They looked at his finances, his travel patterns, his behaviors in the months and years after the murders. They built a chronology of his life, looking for any other incidents, any complaints, any reports that might suggest a pattern of concerning behavior. And they found inconsistencies. Small lies that Voss had told during his original interview. Discrepancies that hadn't been caught the first time around or hadn't seemed important enough to pursue. He'd said he left the work site at 4 on Friday afternoon. But time cards that detectives finally managed to locate after extensive searching showed he'd clocked out at 3. He'd said he went straight home. But no one could confirm that. His wife at the time, his ex-wife now, who detectives tracked down living in California, said she thought he'd gotten home around 6 or 7 that evening, but she couldn't be certain. She'd been busy with their kids, making dinner. She hadn't paid close attention to exactly when he'd walked in the door. Where had Voss been during those missing hours? What had he been doing between 3 in the afternoon when he left work and 6 or 7 in the evening when he arrived home? That was a window of 3 to 4 hours. More than enough time to drive to the campsite, encounter 4 women setting up their tent, and do what had been done. Detectives decided to approach Voss directly in March 2012. They asked him to come in for a voluntary interview, to help them with their review of the case. They framed it as routine, told him they were re-interviewing everyone who'd been in the area that weekend, taking advantage of new technology to look at the case with fresh eyes. He agreed. He seemed cooperative, even eager to help. He came to the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, and for the next several hours, they asked him the same questions he'd been asked 14 years earlier. And his answers had changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that were immediately obvious or that he couldn't explain. But subtly. In 1998, he'd been certain about his timeline. Definitive. He'd left work at 4, driven home, arrived around 4:30. Now, in 2012, he was vaguer. He couldn't quite remember when he'd left the work site. Maybe 4. Maybe a little earlier. It had been so long ago. How could anyone remember exactly? He thought he'd gone straight home, but maybe he'd stopped somewhere. Maybe he'd driven around for a bit. He used to do that sometimes, just drive to clear his head after a long day. Detectives asked him about recognizing Sarah Mitchell's Explorer at the trailhead. Voss paused at that question. Looked uncomfortable for the first time in the interview. Then he said he must have been mistaken about that. Maybe he'd seen a blue vehicle and assumed it was hers later, after he learned about the case and saw her picture in the paper standing in front of her car. Memory plays tricks, he said. Things get confused over time. The brain fills in details that might not have been there originally. Everything he said was plausible. Everything could be explained as the natural fallibility of memory over 14 years. People forget things. Timelines get fuzzy. Details merge together. It's completely normal. But the detectives in that room could feel something shifting. Could sense that Voss was less confident than he'd been in 1998. That the passage of time had made him uncertain about his own story. Or that he was trying to create uncertainty, to muddy the waters, to make it impossible to pin down exactly where he'd been and what he'd done. They asked him if he'd be willing to provide a formal DNA sample. Voss hesitated. For several seconds, he just sat there, looking at the detectives, his expression unreadable. Then he said he wanted to talk to a lawyer first. That he wasn't refusing, he just thought it would be smart to get legal advice before making that kind of decision. That wasn't an admission of guilt. People have every right to consult an attorney before providing DNA. It's a smart thing to do, actually, regardless of innocence or guilt. The legal system is complicated, and having representation is prudent. But it was a change in cooperation level. A signal that Voss now understood he wasn't just a witness being consulted about an old case. He was being looked at differently. He was a suspect. Over the next several months, detectives continued their work. They brought in a criminal psychologist to review the case, to look at Voss's behavior patterns, to provide insight into what might have happened and why. The psychologist's assessment suggested that if Voss was responsible, this was likely not a planned event. It had probably been opportunistic. He'd been in the area, had encountered the women, and something had triggered him. Maybe they'd rejected an advance. Maybe they'd responded to him in a way that enraged him. Maybe there was no rational reason at all. They executed search warrants on Voss's property, looking for anything that might connect him to the crime. They didn't find smoking gun evidence. No bloody clothing hidden in the attic. No trophies kept from the victims. No confession written in a diary. But they found enough inconsistencies, enough questions, enough reasons to believe that Michael Voss had not been entirely truthful in 1998 and was being even less truthful now. The question became, did they have enough to charge him? District Attorney Rebecca Lawson faced a difficult decision. The evidence was largely circumstantial. The DNA was partial, not definitive. A good defense attorney would argue that partial DNA matches are unreliable, that they've been the basis for wrongful convictions before, that reasonable doubt should prevent any conviction based primarily on them. The inconsistencies in Voss's statements could be explained as the natural fallibility of memory over 14 years. The change in his vehicle could have been exactly what he said, mechanical problems. His withdrawal from community activities could have been related to his divorce and personal life changes. Everything had an alternative explanation. But families deserved answers. The community deserved closure. These 4 women deserved someone to speak for them, to fight for them, to say that what happened to them mattered and that whoever did it should be held accountable. And if they didn't act now, would they ever get another chance? Would the evidence degrade further? Would memories fade even more? Would Voss die of old age before justice could be served? Lawson consulted with her team, with the detectives, with forensic experts. She looked at similar cases from around the country, at what evidence had been sufficient for convictions in other cold cases. And she looked at the faces in the photographs of Sarah Mitchell, Rachel Connors, Jennifer Hayes, and Amanda Price. 24, 23, 22, and 26 years old. Lives cut short. Families destroyed. A community traumatized. In November 2012, Rebecca Lawson made the decision. They would proceed with charges. It was a risk. They might lose at trial. But doing nothing was also a choice, and it was one she couldn't live with. On November 14, 2012, 14 years and 1 month after 4 young women died in the Oregon woods, Michael Voss was arrested at his home and charged with 4 counts of murder. The shock that rippled through Timber Ridge that day was almost as profound as the shock of the original crime. Michael Voss? The guy who'd coached Little League? Who'd lived here his whole life? Who'd been part of this community for 5 decades? Who'd been interviewed back in 1998 and cleared? Some people refused to believe it. They organized support for Voss, raised money for his legal defense, insisted that law enforcement had gotten it wrong. They pointed out that he'd been a good neighbor, a decent guy, that he'd never shown any signs of violence or aggression. They created a website proclaiming his innocence. They wore yellow ribbons, held prayer vigils for him, showed up at the courthouse when he was arraigned. Others felt a different kind of shock, the realization that they'd lived near this man, trusted this man, let their children around this man, for 14 years after he'd allegedly done something monstrous. They went back through their memories, trying to see if there had been signs they'd missed. Had he ever said anything strange? Done anything inappropriate? Looking back, could they see it? The town fractured along these lines. Friend turned against friend. Families stopped speaking to each other. Churches split between those who believed in Voss's innocence and those who believed justice was finally being served. The hardware store, which Jenny Hayes' father had closed years ago after her death, became a focal point. People left flowers there for Jenny, but others spray-painted messages supporting Voss on the boarded-up windows. The pre-trial proceedings stretched through 2013. Voss's defense team filed motion after motion to suppress evidence, to challenge the DNA analysis, to exclude witness testimony, to dismiss the charges entirely. The prosecution fought back, arguing that the evidence was solid enough for a jury to consider, that Voss deserved to stand trial, that the families deserved their day in court. Legal arguments were made, ruled on, appealed. Experts were hired and deposed. Witness lists were compiled. The case became the only thing people in Timber Ridge talked about. At the diner, at the grocery store, at the gas station, in church parking lots, the question was always the same: is he guilty? Wherever you're watching from, what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comment. The trial was scheduled to begin in September 2014, 16 years after the murders. Jury selection was set to start the week after Labor Day. Both sides spent the summer preparing. The prosecution refined their strategy, worked with their witnesses, prepared their forensic experts for cross-examination. The defense did the same, building a case around reasonable doubt, around alternative explanations, around the idea that partial DNA evidence and inconsistent memories were not enough to convict a man of murder. But 3 weeks before jury selection was set to start, something happened that no one expected. Michael Voss's attorney, a high-powered criminal defense lawyer named Richard Brennan from Portland, requested a meeting with the prosecution. In that meeting, held in Rebecca Lawson's office on a Thursday afternoon in late August, Brennan presented an offer. Voss would plead guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder in exchange for the prosecution's recommendation of 4 concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole after 25 years. It wasn't a full admission. Second-degree murder meant he wasn't claiming premeditation. He wasn't saying he'd planned this or hunted these women specifically. But he was admitting he'd killed them. After 16 years of silence, after 14 years of living free in the same town where his victims' families grieved, Michael Voss was finally ready to say he'd done it. The prosecution had to consult with the families before accepting or rejecting the plea. This was their decision as much as anyone's. Lawson spent the next several days meeting with the parents and siblings of Sarah Mitchell, Rachel Connors, Jennifer Hayes, and Amanda Price. She laid out the options. Take the plea and guarantee that Voss would go to prison, but give up the possibility of a full trial, of hearing exactly what happened, of the complete truth coming out. Or reject the plea, go to trial, and risk the possibility that a jury might not convict. That the partial DNA might not be enough. That the defense might create enough reasonable doubt to result in an acquittal. That Voss might walk free. It was an impossible choice. The families met together, agonized over the decision. Some wanted the trial. Wanted to see Voss forced to sit there day after day listening to what he'd done, to the impact on their families, to the evidence against him. Wanted the chance for a full public reckoning. Others couldn't bear the thought of a trial. Couldn't handle the idea of sitting in a courtroom for weeks or months, hearing the details, reliving the worst moments of their lives. And couldn't risk the possibility of an acquittal. After days of discussion, debate, tears, and prayer, the families made their decision. They would accept the plea. The guarantee of prison time was worth more than the risk of a trial that might end in acquittal. On September 22, 2014, Michael Voss stood in a county courtroom packed with media, community members, and the families of his victims. He wore a suit. His hair had gone gray. He looked older than his 56 years. The judge asked him how he pleaded to the charges of 4 counts of second-degree murder. Voss stood there for a moment in silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said 3 words that families had waited 16 years to hear: "I am guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some people cried. Others shouted. The judge had to call for order. But for a moment, the careful procedural calm of the courtroom dissolved into raw human emotion. Relief. Rage. Grief. All of it spilling out at once. The judge accepted the plea but rejected the sentencing recommendation. Instead of 4 concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole, she imposed 4 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Voss would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would die there. That was certain. But even in that moment of legal resolution, there was no real satisfaction. Because Voss never explained what had happened that October night in 1998. Never said why he'd done it. Never provided details beyond the bare minimum required by the plea agreement. Never gave these families the one thing they truly wanted: the truth. The complete story. The why that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As part of the plea, Voss was required to give a statement admitting to the crimes in his own words. But his statement was brief and devoid of detail. He said he'd been in the area that evening. That he'd encountered the 4 women. That things had gotten out of hand. That he'd panicked. That he'd done something terrible that he'd regretted every day since. That was it. No explanation of what "out of hand" meant. No description of what had actually happened. No admission of what he'd done to them or why. His lawyer read a prepared statement saying Voss was deeply remorseful, that he'd lived with the guilt for 16 years, that he hoped his plea would bring the families some measure of closure. But Voss himself never looked at the families. Never made eye contact. Never said he was sorry directly to them. Sarah Mitchell's mother, Linda, sat in that courtroom and watched Michael Voss be taken away in handcuffs. She'd waited 16 years for this. 16 years of wondering, of grief that couldn't find resolution, of seeing the man responsible living freely in her town while her daughter was gone forever. She'd imagined this moment countless times. Had thought about what it would feel like, what she would feel. And now it was happening. Justice had arrived. But it arrived without answers. Without the complete story. Without the why that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She sat there as the courtroom slowly emptied, and she realized that this wasn't the ending she'd imagined. It was an ending, yes. But not a satisfying one. Not one that brought peace or closure or any of the things people talked about when they talked about justice. Rachel Connor's father, David, stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing and told reporters that he was grateful Voss would die in prison. That at least there was that. At least he couldn't hurt anyone else. At least he'd been caught and convicted and would be punished. But he also said something else. He said, "I thought this day would feel different. I thought I'd feel something other than tired." That exhaustion was everywhere. In the families. In the investigators who'd worked this case for 16 years. In Emily Mitchell, who'd spent a decade of her adult life pushing for this reopening. In the community that had carried this weight for so long. Justice had been served, yes. But it had come so late, after so much time, that it couldn't repair what had been broken. It couldn't bring anyone back. It couldn't restore the years that had been stolen. Emily Mitchell, who'd been 16 when her sister died, who'd spent a decade of her adult life pushing for this case to be reopened, who'd been the catalyst for the renewed investigation that finally led to Voss's arrest, spoke at a press conference after the sentencing. She thanked the detectives who'd worked the case. She thanked Frank Dalton for keeping his notes and for believing that the case could still be solved. She thanked Sheriff Crane for taking the reinvestigation seriously. She said she was grateful to everyone who'd helped bring this to conclusion. She said she hoped her sister and the other 3 women could rest in peace now, knowing that justice had been served. But she also said something that captured the complexity of this moment. She said, "We got justice. But we didn't get Sarah back. We never get them back. And that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." The question that lingered after Voss's conviction was the one that might never be fully answered: why had it taken 16 years? Why had he been interviewed and dismissed in 1998? What had investigators missed? Could these 4 women have gotten justice sooner? The truth is more complicated than blame or failure. In 1998, law enforcement did what they could with the resources and technology available. They interviewed Voss. They checked his basic alibi. They found nothing conclusive at the time. They moved on to other possibilities because they had to, because in the immediate aftermath of a crime like this, you can't focus all your resources on one person without evidence pointing you there. You have to cast a wide net. You have to pursue multiple leads simultaneously. What changed wasn't just technology, though that played a role. It was time. It was the ability to look back at those early interviews with different questions, with more context, with the benefit of years of hindsight. It was someone like Emily Mitchell refusing to let the case fade away, refusing to accept that some crimes just don't get solved. It was the small accumulation of inconsistencies that only became visible when viewed across the span of years. It was the work of people like Frank Dalton who couldn't let go, who kept their notes, who were willing to revisit painful memories in service of justice. And maybe, if we're being honest, it was luck. The luck that Dalton had kept his notes instead of throwing them away. The luck that Emily Mitchell had the determination and the knowledge to push in the right direction. The luck that DNA technology had advanced just enough to provide that partial match that justified further investigation. The luck that people who'd worked with Voss still remembered small details from 16 years ago. Take away any one of those pieces, and this case might still be unsolved. Cold cases get solved for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's new evidence. Sometimes it's a confession born of guilt or pressure. Sometimes it's just the slow, grinding work of people who refuse to give up. In this case, it was all of those things. It was a combination of persistence, technology, human determination, and the passage of time that eventually revealed the truth about what Michael Voss had done. But solving a case doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't bring anyone back. It doesn't restore the years that were stolen from these four women and from everyone who loved them. Sarah Mitchell was 24 when she died. She would have been 40 in 2014 when Voss was convicted. She might have been married, might have had children, might have been teaching her own kids to camp in those same Oregon woods. She might have stayed in Timber Ridge or moved away. Might have changed careers or stayed at the medical clinic. Might have done 1,000 different things with the years she was supposed to have. Rachel Connors had been teaching second grade for less than a year when she was killed. How many children would she have taught in 16 years? How many lives would she have touched? How many students would have remembered her as the teacher who made them love learning, who believed in them, who gave them confidence? All of that potential, gone. Jennifer Hayes had been working in her family's hardware store, carrying on a legacy that had lasted 3 generations. That store closed in 2003. Her parents couldn't bear to keep it open without her. Her father tried for a few years, but every day in that store was a reminder of what he'd lost. Eventually, he sold the building to someone who turned it into an antique shop. The Hayes hardware sign came down. 70 years of family history ended. And Amanda Price had just come home, had just reconnected with her roots, had just started to imagine what her life in Timber Ridge might look like. She'd been figuring things out, trying to decide what came next after her life in Portland had fallen apart. Maybe she would have stayed in Timber Ridge. Maybe she would have left again. Maybe she would have found what she was looking for, or maybe she would have kept searching. But she deserved the chance to find out. All of that was taken. And no amount of justice can give it back. His children changed their last names. His second wife divorced him immediately after his arrest. His brother moved to another state. They're trying to build lives separate from his crimes, trying to survive the stigma of being related to someone who did what Michael Voss did. There's a question that hangs over this case even now, 10 years after Voss's conviction. If Emily Mitchell hadn't kept pushing, if Frank Dalton hadn't kept his notes, if the DNA technology hadn't advanced just enough to provide that partial match, would Michael Voss ever have been caught? Would this case still be unsolved, filed away in a storage room somewhere, reduced to a statistic about crimes that never get justice? Maybe. Probably. And that's a terrifying thought. Because it means that justice in cases like this isn't inevitable. It's not guaranteed. It requires human effort, human determination, human refusal to accept silence. It requires people like Emily Mitchell who won't let the world move on and forget. Who insist, year after year, that these lives mattered. That someone has to keep asking questions. That time doesn't erase the obligation to find truth. The story of what happened in the Oregon woods in October 1998 is, on one level, a story about evil. About a man who made a choice that destroyed multiple lives for reasons we may never fully understand. But it's also a story about persistence. About a community that refused to forget even when forgetting would have been easier. About families who endured 16 years of uncertainty and pain but never stopped hoping for answers. About an investigation that seemed cold, seemed dead, but was revived by people who believe that justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for. And it's a story about 4 women who went into the woods expecting nothing more than a weekend of friendship and freedom. Who deserved decades more of life than they got. Who are remembered not as victims, but as daughters, sisters, friends, teachers, community members. As people who mattered. Who still matter. Who will always matter. Rest in peace, Sarah Mitchell. Rest in peace, Rachel Connors. Rest in peace, Jennifer Hayes. Rest in peace, Amanda Price. Your lives were stolen, but your memory endures. In the scholarship students who bear your names. In the memorial that stands at the edge of town. In every person who hears this story and is reminded that behind every crime statistic is a human being who was loved, who was missed, who deserved better than they got. These stories exist for a reason. Not to glorify violence. Not to sensationalize tragedy. But to remember. To witness. To insist that even when justice takes decades to arrive, it still matters. That even when the answers come too late to undo the damage, they're still worth finding. That the people we lose to violence deserve more than silence and forgetting. The human capacity for evil is real. We see it in cases like this, in the choices people make, in the damage they inflict. But so is the human capacity for persistence. For love. For the refusal to let go. For the determination to keep asking questions even when it seems hopeless. For the belief that truth matters, that justice matters, that these lives matter enough to fight for across years and decades. If you stayed with this story to the end, you're someone who understands why these cases need to be told. Why we can't let them fade into obscurity just because time has passed. Why every solved cold case, no matter how long it takes, represents not just closure for a family, but a reminder that the passage of time doesn't erase our obligation to seek truth. You're someone who believes that justice, even when delayed by years or decades, still holds meaning. That accountability, even when it comes too late to prevent suffering, still matters. That remembering the dead is a form of resistance against the forgetting that evil depends on. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. In Timber Ridge, Oregon, there's a truth that the community has learned through painful experience. Evil can hide in plain sight. It can wear a familiar face, coach your children's teams, volunteer at the fire department, live next door for years without anyone suspecting. But there's another truth that's equally important, equally powerful. Persistence can unmask that evil. Questions can lead to answers. And families who refuse to let go can, sometimes, after years or decades, find the justice they've been seeking. The woods where Sarah Mitchell, Rachel Connors, Jennifer Hayes, and Amanda Price died are still there. The trails are still used by hikers and campers. Life continues. The seasons change. The trees grow. The forest is indifferent to human tragedy, as forests always are. But on October 15th every year, if you were to visit that memorial at the edge of town, you'd find flowers. Fresh flowers. Left by people who remember. Who refuse to forget. Who insist that these 4 women deserved better than they got, and that their memory deserves more than silence. That remembering is how we honor them. Not just with memorials and scholarships, though those matter. But by refusing to accept that any case is truly unsolvable. By believing that truth matters enough to pursue it across decades. By insisting that justice, no matter how long delayed, is still worth fighting for. By holding space for complexity, for the reality that solving a case doesn't undo the damage, that convicting a killer doesn't bring anyone back, that justice and healing are not the same thing but both still matter. Some questions last longer than others. I'll see you in the next one.